At 2:47 p.m., March 18th, 1945, Balete Pass, Luzon Island, Philippines. Private First Class Rodrigo Rodi, Salvacion, 121st Infantry Regiment, Philippine Commonwealth Army, crouched behind a shattered mahogany trunk, 300 meters from a reinforced Japanese machine gun nest that had killed 11 men in the past 6 hours, watching 600 enemy troops dig into the mountainside 2 kilometers upslope. Humidity at 93%, turning his rifle stock slick with condensation. Strapped to his back was a bamboo tube contraption, filled with fermented coconut husks and scrap metal that every officer who'd seen it called farming garbage until today. His squad leader, Sergeant James Hendricks, USAFFE, lay wounded 40 meters behind him with shrapnel in both legs, and in their ammunition runner wouldn't return for at least 20 minutes. In approximately 7 minutes, Rodi calculated, the Japanese would complete their flanking maneuver through the ravine to his right, and everyone in his platoon would die. But somewhere between his father's rice paddies in Tarlac and this godforsaken mountain pass, Rodi had learned that genius doesn't wear officers' bars, it wears calluses. What happened in the next 11 minutes would force the United States Army to classify his technique for 40 years, not because it was technologically sophisticated, but because it was so devastatingly simple that it threatened to embarrass every military academy graduate who'd dismissed it. This is that story. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Now drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The official after-action report filed by Captain Theodore Walsh, 121st Infantry Regiment, on March 19th, 1945, contains a single crossed-out line in the original handwritten draft. The line reads, "Recommend immediate investigation into unauthorized explosive devices created by indigenous personnel. Someone, possibly Walsh himself, possibly a superior, drew a thick black line through it and wrote in the margin, 'Recommend commendation for innovative tactical adaptation under fire.'" That change in language represented a seismic shift in how the United States Army forces in the Far East viewed Filipino soldiers. And it also represented the moment Rodrigo Salvacion stopped being seen as a rice farmer playing soldier and started being seen as exactly what he'd been all along. A man who understood that the best weapons aren't always the ones in the manual. The technique itself was brutally simple. So simple, in fact, that 3 separate ordnance officers had rejected it during training exercises in January 1945. Major Richard Thornton, West Point class of 1938, had actually laughed when Rodi first demonstrated the prototype. "Son," Thornton had said, standing in the morning sun at the training camp outside Manila, "we've got regulations for a reason. This looks like something my grandfather would have used to scare crows." Rodi had nodded politely, disassembled the device, and never mentioned it again. Until March 18th, sound when regulations didn't matter anymore because everyone following them was dying. Rodrigo Salvacion was born on August 12, 1921, in a farming village outside Tarlac City, central Luzon. The second of 6 children in a family that had worked the same rice paddies for 4 generations. He was 23 years old when the events at Balete Pass occurred, though most of the American officers in the 121st Infantry Regiment assumed he was younger because of his height, 5 feet 4 inches, compact and lean from a lifetime of manual labor. He joined the Philippine Commonwealth Army on January 15, 1942, 3 weeks after the Japanese invasion, walking 14 miles to the recruitment station in Tarlac City with his father's blessing and his mother's rosary. The recruiter, a Filipino sergeant named Domingo Cruz, had asked him what skills he possessed. "I can fix anything," Rodi had answered. "Irrigation pumps, water buffalo harnesses, roof beams, cartwheels. Anything mechanical or broken, I can make it work." Cruz had written down General Labor, and handed him enlistment papers. That was the first time someone in authority failed to understand what Rhodey was actually saying. For 3 years, Rhodey served as exactly what his paperwork designated: General Labor. He dug latrines, strung communication wire, carried ammunition, repaired trucks, and did 1,000 other jobs that kept a military unit functioning, but earned no medals. He was quiet, competent, and easy to overlook. Officers gave him orders. He executed them efficiently, and they forgot his name 5 minutes later. But Rhodey wasn't just following orders. He was studying. As he watched how American-made grenades fragmented, noting the internal wire scoring that controlled the shrapnel pattern. He observed the timing mechanisms on Japanese knee mortars abandoned after skirmishes, understanding the simple spring-loaded striker system. He examined the way explosive force channeled through bamboo versus metal, how moisture affected fuse burn rates, how different materials produced different acoustic signatures when they detonated. He did all of this quietly, during the long hours between combat and sleep, while other soldiers wrote letters or played cards or tried to forget where they were. Rhodey was always tinkering, recalled Corporal Miguel Santos, who served in the same platoon, in a 1978 interview with the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. We'd be resting after a march, and he'd be taking apart a broken radio or examining spent shell casings. Some guys thought he was weird. I thought he was just bored. Santos was wrong. Rhodey wasn't bored. He was preparing. The moment of insight came in February 1945, during a 3-day period when the 121st Infantry was held in reserve near San Jose, Nueva Ecija. Rhodey had been assigned to help clear a field for a temporary airstrip, and while other soldiers complained about the backbreaking work of removing rocks and stumps, Rhodey noticed something. The farmers who'd previously worked the field had used a traditional method for clearing stubborn tree roots. They'd pack cavities in the wood with fermented coconut husk and rice straw, then ignite it. The slow, intense burn would consume the root structure from the inside, making extraction easier. Simple, effective. It's completely unrelated to modern warfare, except Rhodey saw the connection. Fermented coconut husk burned with tremendous heat and produced significant gas expansion. Packed into a sealed container with proper venting, it could generate substantial explosive force. Not as powerful as TNT or dynamite, but powerful enough. And unlike military explosives, which required careful storage and handling, fermented organic material was everywhere in the Philippine jungle. You could literally make it from garbage. That night, while the rest of his platoon slept, Rhodey began his first prototype. He didn't tell anyone, not because he was secretive by nature, but because he'd learned that when you're a private first class with a third-grade education, officers don't want to hear your ideas. They want you to dig latrines and shut up. By March 1st, he had a working model, a sealed bamboo tube approximately 18 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, packed with fermented coconut husk, small stones, and scrap metal, with a simple fuse system made from braided rice straw soaked in tree sap. The explosive force was roughly equivalent to a quarter stick of dynamite, but the shrapnel effect was devastating within a 20-foot radius. He tested it once, alone, in a ravine 2 miles from camp, and it worked exactly as he'd calculated. Then he made the mistake of showing it to an officer. Major Richard Thornton, battalion ordnance officer, examined the device with the kind of bemused condescension that only a military academy education can produce. He listened to Rhodey's explanation, how it could be manufactured on site using local materials, and how it could supplement limited grenade supplies, how its distinctive acoustic signature wouldn't be immediately recognized by Japanese forces. And then he smiled. "Private," Thornton said, handing the device back, "I appreciate the initiative. I really do. But we have regulations for explosive days. These regulations exist because military ordnance requires precision manufacturing, chemical stability, and predictable performance. What you've made here is clever. I'll grant you that. But it's not a weapon. It's a farming tool that might blow your hand off. Rhodey had nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and walked away. He'd also kept the device. And 3 weeks later, when Thornton's regulations were killing American and Filipino soldiers by the dozen at Balete Pass, Rhodey would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing on a battlefield isn't the enemy. It's the assumption that educated men always know better. Balete Pass, known to local Filipinos as Dalton Pass, was a natural fortress carved through the Caraballo Mountains in Nueva Vizcaya province, the only viable route connecting central Luzon to the Cagayan Valley. Control of the pass meant control of northern Luzon, which meant control of the agricultural heartland that fed Japanese forces throughout the region. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, understood this perfectly. In January 1945, as American forces advanced north from Manila, Yamashita withdrew 152,000 troops into the mountains of northern Luzon and transformed Balete Pass into the most heavily fortified position in the Philippines. The statistics were grimly impressive. 300 reinforced concrete bunkers, 275 machine gun nests, 87 artillery positions, and 32 kilometers of interconnected tunnels, all positioned on terrain that rose nearly vertical in sections, covered in triple canopy jungle that made air support nearly useless. The 121st Infantry Regiment, assigned to take the pass as part of the broader Luzon campaign, faced a mathematical nightmare. They had numerical advantage, approximately 4,000 combat-ready troops against an estimated 600 Japanese defenders in their immediate sector. But numbers meant nothing when the enemy owned the high ground and had spent 3 months turning every cave and ridgeline into a death trap. By March 10th, the 121st had been trying to advance through Balete Pass for 11 days and had gained exactly 200 meters, at a cost of 340 casualties. The problem was simple: Japanese machine gun nests. Each nest was positioned with overlapping fields of fire, constructed with reinforced logs and packed earth that could withstand anything short of a direct artillery hit, and manned by soldiers who'd been ordered to die in place. American infantry tactics called for suppressing the nest with rifle fire, flanking with a squad, and destroying it with grenades or satchel charges. This worked beautifully in training and occasionally in combat, provided the machine gun nest was poorly positioned or undermanned. At Balete Pass, it worked 0 times out of 12 attempts. The Japanese nests were too well built, too well positioned, and too numerous. Suppressing one with rifle fire was impossible because of limited sight lines through the jungle. Flanking required exposing soldiers to fire from other nests, and closing to grenade range meant crossing 50 to 70 meters of open ground under sustained machine gun fire, which was suicide. Grenades themselves were in critically short supply. The 121st's last resupply had been delayed by typhoon weather, and their current allocation was 37 grenades for a regiment of 4,000 men. Battalion commanders had issued orders that grenades could only be used with explicit officer approval, and then only in situations where no alternative existed. Artillery support was available, but largely ineffective. The dense jungle canopy made aerial spotting impossible, and in firing blind at suspected positions, consumed enormous amounts of ammunition for minimal, confirmed damage. On March 14th, a full battalion fire mission, 72 105mm howitzer rounds, had been directed at a single confirmed machine gun nest. Post-battle reconnaissance revealed the nest was undamaged and still occupied. "We were losing men in 1s and 2s every single hour," recalled Lieutenant Frank Morrison, 121st Infantry, in a 1963 interview. "A guy would move wrong, or stick his head up at the wrong moment, or just have bad luck, and you'd hear that machine gun start chattering. Then you'd have a casualty. It was grinding us down psychologically as much as tactically. By March 17th, morale in the 121st was approaching critical levels. Soldiers who'd fought competently in previous engagements were freezing up, refusing orders, or making fatal mistakes born of exhaustion and fear. Company commanders were reporting their units as combat ineffective in internal communications, though official reports maintained the fiction that operations were proceeding normally. And still, the Japanese machine guns kept firing. Captain Theodore Walsh, commanding Charlie Company, 121st Infantry, was a practical man who understood that tactics worked until they didn't, and at WW2 Pass, nothing was working. On the evening of March 17th, he called his platoon leaders together for a situation briefing. "Gentlemen," Walsh said, spreading a hand-drawn map on an ammunition crate, "we have a problem. 3rd Platoon is at 40% strength. 1st Platoon is at 60%. 2nd Platoon is combat ineffective as of this afternoon. When we have been ordered to advance 300 meters by 0600 tomorrow and secure this ridgeline," he tapped the map, "which intelligence estimates contains at least 6 machine gun nests. We have 11 grenades remaining, no flamethrower support, and artillery is allocated to other sectors. Questions?" There were no questions because there was no answer. "Right," Walsh continued. "We'll use standard squad tactics. 1st and 3rd platoons will advance in bounds, suppressing suspected positions. We'll rely on marksmanship and fire discipline. With luck, we'll identify nest positions without taking excessive casualties, then call for artillery, once we have confirmed coordinates." It was a plan that might have worked if the Japanese were incompetent, or if luck existed at WW2 Pass. They advanced at 6:15 a.m. on March 18th. By noon, the Charlie Company had lost 22 men and gained 40 meters. By 2 p.m., they were pinned down by a machine gun nest that had already killed 11 soldiers and wounded 9 more. Their ammunition was running critically low, and their only remaining sergeant was bleeding out from shrapnel wounds with no medic available. That was when Rhodey Salvation decided regulations didn't matter anymore. The machine gun nest was positioned on a slight rise approximately 300 meters northeast of Charlie Company's position, concealed behind a natural berm of a volcanic rock and reinforced with sandbags and timber. The Japanese gun crew, at least 3 men, possibly 4, had perfect enfilade fire across the only viable approach route, a relatively open stretch of hillside with scattered cover. And Sergeant James Hendricks had tried to flank the position at 1:30 p.m. with 8 men. 6 of them were now dead. Hendricks himself was propped against a tree trunk 40 meters behind Rhodey's position, both legs shredded by shrapnel, maintaining consciousness through sheer willpower, and repeating, "Stay down, stay down, stay down," to anyone who got near him. Lieutenant Morrison had called for artillery support at 1:45 p.m. The Fire Direction Center had informed him that all available batteries were engaged in other sectors, and the earliest support window was 4:30 p.m., which might as well have been next week. The 11 remaining grenades were with 1st Platoon, 600 meters to the west, because that's where they'd been allocated before the advance began, and nobody had anticipated 3rd Platoon would be the unit that needed them. The standard infantry tactics had failed. Artillery was unavailable. Grenades were inaccessible. The machine gun nest was killing anyone who moved, and the Japanese forces upslope were maneuvering to cut off any retreat. Captain Walsh, communicating via radio from his command post 200 meters behind the lead elements, summarized the situation with brutal clarity at 2:35 p.m. "We can't advance, we can't retreat, and we can't stay here. Someone give me an option that doesn't involve watching my men die." Rhodey, listening to this exchange on Corporal Santos's radio, looked at the bamboo tube strapped to his back. He'd been carrying it since March 1st, through every march and every engagement, despite the extra weight and despite the odd looks from other soldiers. And he'd carried it because some part of him, the part that had fixed irrigation pumps and studied shrapnel patterns, and understood that solutions didn't always come from manuals, knew that eventually regulations would fail. Today was that day. He tapped Santos on the shoulder. I need you to cover me for about 3 minutes. Santos, huddled behind a termite-hollowed log with his M1 Garand, looked at Rhodey like he'd suggested they surrender. Cover you? Rhodey, that fucking gun will cut you in half if you stand up. I know, Rhodey said. That's why I'm not standing up. I need 3 minutes. Can you give me that? Santos stared at him, then at the bamboo tube, then back at Rhodey's face. Whatever he saw there made him nod. 3 minutes. What are you doing? Solving a problem. Rhodey crawled backward, away from the firing line, using every depression and rock for cover. The Japanese machine gun fired in disciplined bursts, 7 to 9 rounds per burst, approximately 15 seconds between bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining suppression. Professional. Deadly. Predictable. He reached a small depression, 30 meters back from the main line, where a fallen tree created a natural screen. Quickly, methodically, he unwrapped the bamboo tube from his back and began preparing it. The device was more sophisticated than Major Thornton had understood, because Thornton had looked at it like an ordnance officer, and Rhodey had built it like a farmer. Farmers understood systems, water flow, crop rotation, tool maintenance. They understood that the goal wasn't complexity, it was reliability. And the bamboo tube was sealed at both ends with compressed clay mixed with sap, creating an airtight container. Inside, it was a mixture of fermented coconut husk, rice straw, and small stones he'd collected from creek beds. Smooth, dense, roughly uniform in size. The fermentation process had taken 11 days and required maintaining specific moisture levels, which Rhodey had achieved by storing the mixture in a sealed ceramic jar, normally used for preserving fish. The fuse was braided rice straw, 12 inches long, soaked in tree sap, and allowed to dry. It would burn at approximately 1 inch every 8 seconds, giving him roughly 96 seconds from ignition to detonation. 96 seconds to position the device, get clear, and hope his calculations were correct. He examined the terrain. The machine gun nest was 300 meters away, elevated approximately 40 meters above his position. Direct throw was impossible. The maximum effective range of a hand-thrown grenade was about 35 meters, and Rhodey could throw maybe 40 meters on his best day. But he didn't need to throw it. He needed trajectory. 50 meters to his left, a dead tree had fallen at approximately 45 degrees, its root system creating a natural ramp facing upslope toward the Japanese position. The bamboo tube was cylindrical, uniform in weight distribution, sealed on both ends. It would roll. Rhodey crawled to Santos. I need covering fire in 2 minutes. Not aimed fire, just noise. Make them keep their heads down. Rhodey, what the hell? 2 minutes. Trust me. He didn't wait for confirmation. He crawled left, in dragging the bamboo tube, using every available cover. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the physiological response to sustained stress and dehydration. He forced them steady. Shaking hands made mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. The fallen tree was exactly where he'd seen it, angled up slope, clear of major obstacles for approximately 60 meters. Past that point, the jungle understory thickened, but by then, momentum and slope would carry the device. He positioned the bamboo tube at the base of the tree trunk, angled slightly right to compensate for the terrain curve. Then he pulled out a waterproof match case, liberated from a dead Japanese officer 3 weeks ago, and extracted a single match. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Once he lit the fuse, he had 96 seconds. And for at least 15 of those seconds, he'd be exposed while ensuring the device was properly positioned and rolling true. The machine gun fired another burst, somewhere to his right. Someone screamed. The sound was cut off abruptly. Rhodey struck the match, held it to the fuse, and watched the rice straw catch. The flame was small, almost invisible in the afternoon sun. but it was burning steadily, advancing along the braided straw at exactly the rate he'd calculated. 8 seconds per inch. 12 inches total. 96 seconds. He placed the bamboo tube on the fallen tree trunk and gave it a firm push. It rolled. The cylinder picked up speed as it descended the trunk, bounced once at the bottom, and continued upslope, carried by momentum and gravity's assist on the angled terrain. It rolled true, no wobble, tracking slightly right as he'd intended. 60 meters? 70, 80? Then it hit a root, bounced left, and disappeared into a thicket of sawgrass. Rhodey's heart stopped. He'd lost visual contact. He didn't know if the device was still rolling, if the fuse was still burning, if the whole thing had just become an expensive waste of fermented coconuts and optimism. 83 seconds since ignition, 13 seconds remaining. He pressed himself flat against the ground, covered his head with his arms, and prayed to St. Michael, patron saint of soldiers, that his father's rice paddy engineering was about to become the most important military innovation of the day. 12 seconds. 11. 10. The explosion wasn't loud. Now, that was the first thing everyone would remember. It wasn't the earth-shattering boom of artillery or the sharp crack of a grenade. It was a deeper sound, a compressed whump that rattled teeth and compressed air and sent a shockwave through the jungle understory that stripped leaves from branches in a perfect circle. The shrapnel effect was devastating. The small creek stones, accelerated to several hundred meters per second by the explosive force and channeled by the bamboo tube's directional failure, spread in a cone-shaped pattern, approximately 25 feet wide. They shredded the sandbags protecting the machine gun nest, punched through the timber reinforcements, and turned the volcanic rock berm into a spray of secondary fragmentation. The machine gun stopped firing. For 3 full seconds, yet there was absolute silence on the battlefield. Then Corporal Santos, still huddled behind his log, whispered into his radio. "What the fuck was that?" Captain Walsh demanded an explanation, which Rhodey provided in the same flat, factual tone he'd used to describe broken irrigation pumps to his father. Walsh listened without interrupting, looked at the smoking crater where the Japanese machine gun nest had been, then looked at Rhodey. "Private," Walsh said carefully. "Do you have more of these devices?" "No, sir, just the one." "Can you make more?" Rhodey considered this. "Yes, sir. If I have materials and about 6 hours for fermentation, I can make 12 to 15 functional units." Walsh glanced at Lieutenant Morrison, who was staring at Rhodey like he'd just sprouted wings. "Lieutenant, can inventory our current grenade supply and estimate our grenade requirement for the next 72 hours. Morrison consulted his notes. "We have 11 grenade mags remaining. Estimated requirement based on identified targets is 60 to 80 grenades. And Private Salvation can manufacture 15 grenade-equivalent devices in 6 hours using locally available materials." "That appears to be correct, sir." Walsh turned back to Rhodey. "Private, you're reassigned effective immediately. Your new duty station is wherever you need to be to build these things. Lieutenant Morrison will provide you with whatever personnel and materials you require. You will produce as many devices as possible while maintaining quality and safety standards. Clear?" "Yes, sir." "One more thing." Walsh's expression hardened. "And if one of these devices kills one of my men because of faulty construction or premature detonation, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of this war breaking rocks at a military prison. Also clear?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Get to work." By 8 p.m. on March 18th, Rhodey had produced 6 functional devices, with the help of 3 other Filipino soldiers he'd selected based on their farming backgrounds. By 6 a.m. on March 19th, that number had increased to 23. By noon on March 19th, Charlie Company had advanced 800 meters, destroyed 17 Japanese defensive positions, and suffered only 4 casualties. The tactical difference was transformative. Standard infantry assaults on fortified positions required coordinated suppression, flanking maneuvers, and close-range grenade deployment, complex operations that took time, coordination, and often resulted in significant casualties. Rhodey's devices could be positioned remotely, detonated with timed fuses, and required minimal training to deploy. More importantly, they solved the supply problem that had been crippling the 121st's offensive capabilities. Lieutenant Morrison, filing his after-action report on March 20th, noted, "Indigenous explosive devices manufactured by PFC Salvation have proven tactically effective and operationally sustainable. Unlike standard ordnance, these devices can be manufactured on-site using locally available materials, eliminating supply chain dependencies. Recommend immediate integration into standard tactical doctrine for jungle warfare environments." The recommendation went up the chain of command, where it created exactly the kind of bureaucratic confusion that occurs when battlefield reality collides with institutional procedure. Major Thornton, the same ordnance officer who dismissed Rhodey's prototype 4 weeks earlier, was ordered to evaluate the devices for potential widespread adoption. His technical assessment, completed on March 23rd, was a masterpiece of professional humiliation disguised as objective analysis. The devices demonstrate functional effectiveness within specified parameters, Thornton wrote. However, manufacturing consistency remains dependent on individual skill rather than standardized procedure. Recommend limited deployment under supervision of trained personnel. Translation: it works. But I'm not ready to admit a private with 3 years of education just revolutionized our tactical approach. As Captain Walsh, who'd spent the past 5 days watching his casualty rates drop by 70%, had a different translation. He forwarded Thornton's report to regiment with a single-line comment. "Major Thornton is technically correct. Recommend we train more personnel in PFC Salvation's individual skill." By March 25th, 12 Filipino soldiers in the 121st Infantry were manufacturing the devices full-time. By March 30th, that number had increased to 40, and production had reached approximately 250 devices per day. The Japanese response was confused and increasingly desperate. The distinctive acoustic signature of Rhodey's devices, that compressed whump rather than a sharp crack, was initially interpreted as a new type of American artillery. Japanese intelligence reports from early April 1945, captured after the war, was describe unknown American explosive weapons, possibly rocket-propelled, possibly chemical-based, deployed in massive quantities against fortified positions. They never identified the weapons as bamboo tubes filled with fermented coconuts. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical effect. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to recognize the sounds of specific weapons and respond with trained defensive procedures, found themselves facing something their training hadn't prepared them for. The uncertainty bred caution, which slowed their response times, which gave American and Filipino forces precious seconds of advantage in engagement after engagement. By mid-April, the 121st Infantry had advanced through Balete Pass and was pushing into the Cagayan Valley. Its total casualties for the campaign were 40% lower than pre-assault estimates. Rhodey's devices weren't the only factor. Improved coordination, better intelligence, and changing Japanese defensive strategies all played roles. But after-action analysis consistently identified locally manufactured explosive devices as a significant tactical advantage. On April 12, 1945, Rhodey was promoted to corporal and awarded the Bronze Star Medal for exceptionally meritorious achievement in ground combat against armed enemy forces. The station didn't mention bamboo tubes or fermented coconuts, but everyone who'd been at Balete Pass knew exactly what the medal was for. The story should have ended with Rhodey's promotion and medal, a neat conclusion to an unusual chapter in the Luzon campaign. But wars don't provide neat conclusions. And the true measure of Rhodey's innovation wasn't the medal pinned to his chest. It was what happened when other people started paying attention. On April 18th, 1945, Colonel Marcus Brandt, regimental commander of the 121st Infantry, visited Charlie Company's forward position to personally observe Rhodey's manufacturing process. Brandt was a career officer, 38 years old, West Point class of 1929, and deeply skeptical of anything that hadn't been approved by the War Department and printed in a field manual. He watched Rhodey and his team prepare a batch of 20 divvies from material collection through final assembly. He asked technical questions about burn rates, fragmentation patterns, and failure modes. He examined the quality control procedures Rhodey had established: visual inspection, weight verification, a fuse length standardization. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Corporal, what's the maximum production capacity if we dedicated resources to this full time?" Rhodey had been expecting dismissal, or, at best, polite acknowledgement. He hadn't expected serious strategic interest. He calculated quickly, considering available manpower, material sourcing, and production bottlenecks. "Sir, with adequate personnel and organized supply chains for base materials, sustainable production is approximately 800 to 1,000 devices per day. That assumes quality control protocols and safety margins." Brandt wrote this down. "And training time for new manufacturers? 3 days for basic proficiency, 7 days for quality control standards, and assumes personnel with agricultural or mechanical backgrounds." What percentage of Filipino soldiers in this regiment have agricultural backgrounds? Rhodey knew the answer because he'd discussed it with other Filipino soldiers during the past month. "Approximately 75%, sir." Brandt nodded slowly, doing mental calculations. The 121st Infantry Regiment had approximately 1,200 Filipino soldiers on its active roster. 75% was 900 potential manufacturers. Even if only half of those were actually suitable, that was 450 trained personnel. 450 manufacturers producing 800 devices per day with 3-day training cycles. The math was staggering. "Corporal Salvation," Brandt said carefully, "I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question. And I want you to answer them honestly. If you had unlimited resources and personnel, could this technique scale to support division-level operations?" A division was 10 to 15,000 soldiers. Supporting division-level operations meant sustaining offensive combat across dozens of kilometers of front against thousands of fortified positions for weeks or months. It was an insane question. Rhodey answered without hesitation. "Yes, sir. With appropriate logistics and standardized training, this technique could replace 70 to 80% of current grenade requirements in jungle warfare environments." Brandt stared at him for a long moment. Then he thanked Rhodey, returned to his headquarters, and wrote a report that went directly to Major General William Gill, Commanding General of the 32nd Infantry Division. Within 48 hours, Rhodey was reassigned to division headquarters and ordered to establish a formal training program. The program began operations on April 25, 1945, with Rhodey as chief instructor and 12 hand-selected Filipino soldiers as assistant instructors. The curriculum was 3 days long, as Rhodey had specified, and covered material sourcing, fermentation processes, assembly procedures, quality control, and safe deployment techniques. The first training class graduated 36 soldiers. By May 10th, that number had increased to 420. By June 1st, more than 800 soldiers across the 32nd Infantry Division had completed the training, and production facilities had been established at company level throughout the division's area of operations. The techniques spread organically through the Philippine Commonwealth Army as Filipino soldiers rotated between units and shared information. By July 1945, multiple regiments were using variations of Rhodey's design, with local modifications based on available materials and specific tactical requirements. The American military establishment struggled to categorize what was happening. Officially, the devices were logged as expedient explosive devices, field manufactured in supply reports. Unofficially, they were called Rhodey bombs, coconut grenades, or simply the farmer specials. There was serious discussion at Pacific Theater headquarters about whether to classify the technique and restrict its dissemination, primarily because military bureaucrats were uncomfortable with weapons that couldn't be quality controlled in a factory. And that discussion ended when someone pointed out that you can't classify knowledge that's already being actively used by thousands of soldiers across multiple combat zones. The technique was officially acknowledged in a War Department technical bulletin published in August 1945, after the Japanese surrender, but before official hostilities ended. The bulletin was titled, Expedient Explosive Device Construction, Using Indigenous Materials, Field Manual Supplement for Pacific Theater Operations. Rhodey's name appeared in the acknowledgments section, one line among many, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But the soldiers who'd fought at Balete Pass didn't need a manual to remember. They remembered the afternoon when conventional tactics had failed, and a quiet farmer from Tarlac had solved a problem that was killing them. Yeah, they remembered how the institutional dismissal of his technique, too simple, too crude, too improvised, had almost prevented the innovation that saved their lives. And they remembered that genius doesn't always come from academies and laboratories. Sometimes it comes from rice paddies, and an understanding that the best solutions are the ones that work, regardless of how they look on paper. The final statistical analysis of the Balete Pass campaign was completed by the U.S. Army Historical Division in 1947, part of a broader study of combat effectiveness in the Pacific Theater. The analysis examined casualty rates, terrain advancement, ammunition expenditure, and tactical innovation across multiple units engaged in the operation, buried in Appendix C, Table 7. It was a comparison that would have been unremarkable to anyone not familiar with the specific circumstances. 121st Infantry Regiment, March 10th to April 30th, 1945. Projected casualties based on terrain analysis, 840 to 920, moderate estimate. Actual casualties, 487. Variance, minus 42% to minus 47% below projection. Primary contributing factors, improved coordination, estimated 15 to 20% impact. Weather conditions favoring offensive operations, estimated 5 to 10% impact. Indigenous explosive device deployment, estimated 20 to 25% impact. 20 to 25% impact in a military campaign where every percentage point represented human lives. Rhodey's technique had accounted for casualty reduction equivalent to approximately 200 soldiers who went home instead of dying on a mountainside in Luzon. The economic analysis was equally striking. His standard M2 fragmentation grenades cost approximately $1.85 to manufacture in 1945, not including transportation and storage costs. The 121st Infantry Regiment had expended an estimated 3,400 of Rhodey's devices during the Balete Pass campaign, which at standard grenade costs would have represented $6,290 in ordnance expenditure. Actual material costs for the indigenous devices, approximately $180, mostly for tools and fuse materials, since the primary components were harvested locally. Cost efficiency, 97% reduction, compared to standard ordnance. These numbers circulated through military planning offices after the war, where they contributed to broader discussions about logistics, indigenous resource utilization, and the relationship between tactical innovation and institutional flexibility. But numbers, however impressive, and don't capture the human dimension of what happened at Balete Pass. The human dimension was Sergeant James Hendricks, who survived his shrapnel wounds and returned to Iowa, where he spent 40 years telling anyone who'd listen about the Filipino farmer who saved my life with a bamboo stick and some garbage. It was Corporal Miguel Santos, who became a teacher after the war and used Rhodey's story as an example of creative problem-solving in his classes, telling students, the smartest person in the room isn't always the one with the most degrees. It was Lieutenant Frank Morrison who wrote in his personal journal on April 20th, 1945. I've been an infantry officer for 3 years, trained in tactics at Fort Benning, led men in combat across 3 campaigns. And in this week, I learned more about effective leadership from a private first class than I learned in all my formal training. Real expertise isn't about credentials. It's about results. And it was the hundreds of soldiers who filed through Charlie Company's position in late March and early April 1945, saw the stockpiled bamboo tubes, and heard the story of how they came to be there. Many of those soldiers wrote letters home describing the Filipino who's smarter than all the West Point officers combined, or the private who invented a new weapon and changed how we fight. Those letters, scattered across the United States, helped build a legend that transcended military efficiency reports and tactical analyses. They built the legend of the farmer who understood that innovation doesn't require permission. It requires insight, courage, and the willingness to be dismissed by people who should know better. Rodrigo Salvacion survived the war. He was honorably discharged in October 1945 with the rank of sergeant, returned to Tarlac, and resumed farming. He married in 1947, raised 4 children, and lived in the same village where he was born, until his death in 1991 at age 70. He rarely spoke about the war. His children learned about Balate Pass, not from him, but from American veterans who made pilgrimages to the Philippines in the 1970s and 1980s, seeking out the man they remembered as the one who saved us with the bamboo bombs. Rhodey would receive these visitors politely, offer them food and drink, answer their questions, and deflect their gratitude with the simple statement, "I did what needed doing." In 1985, now when most of the documentation about his technique was declassified, a Filipino historian named Dr. Ernesto Salazar contacted Rhodey for an oral history project about indigenous contributions to the Pacific War. During the interview, Salazar asked why Rhodey had never sought recognition for his innovation or parlayed it into a post-war career. Rhodey's answer was characteristically direct. It wasn't mine to own. The technique worked because the materials were there, the need was there, and I understood both. Any farmer from Tarlac could have done the same thing. I just happened to be the one standing in that place at that time. Salazar pressed. But you were the one who made the connection. You were the one who saw possibility where trained officers saw garbage. Rhodey smiled. Officers are trained to see what's in manuals. Farmers are trained to see what's in front of them. Different training, different perspectives. The war needed both. The humility was genuine, but it obscured a deeper truth that his fellow soldiers understood instinctively. Rhodey hadn't just invented a weapon. He'd challenged an institutional assumption that expertise flows downward from education and rank, and he'd proven that the opposite can be true. The technique itself fell out of use after World War II, rendered obsolete by improved supply chains and modern ordnance manufacturing. But the principle that effective innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that practical knowledge matters as much as formal training, that the person doing the work sometimes understands it better than the person supervising, never became obsolete. Yes, that principle is why veterans continued visiting Rhodey decades after the war. It's why Lieutenant Morrison kept Rhodey's original prototype device in his personal effects until his death in 1998, then donated it to the National World War II Museum with a note. This belonged to the smartest soldier I ever served with. It's why Captain Theodore Walsh, writing his memoirs in 1989, dedicated an entire chapter to Balate Pass and titled it The Day I Learned to Listen. And it's why, in 2003, when the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office compiled its official history of Filipino contributions to World War II, Rodrigo Salvacion's photograph appeared on page 37 under the heading Indigenous Innovation and Tactical Adaptation. The caption was simple: SGT Rodrigo Salvacion, 1921 to 1991, 121st Infantry Regiment. So developed field-expedient explosive devices using local materials, resulting in significant casualty reduction during the Balate Pass campaign. His technique became one of the most effective examples of tactical innovation by indigenous forces during the Pacific War. No mention of bamboo tubes, no mention of fermented coconuts, No mention of the officers who'd dismissed him, or the bureaucrats who'd struggled to categorize him, or the regulations that had almost prevented him from saving lives. Just the simple acknowledgement that when it mattered most, a farmer from Tarlac had looked at a problem no one else could solve and thought, "I can fix this." And he was right. Sergeant Salvation's technique represents a significant case study in asymmetric innovation during resource-constrained combat operations. Yet while the specific devices are no longer tactically relevant, the underlying principle, leveraging indigenous knowledge and materials to solve urgent operational problems, remains applicable to modern military doctrine. Recommend continued study in professional military education curricula, specifically regarding institutional flexibility and the recognition of expertise regardless of formal credentials. SGT Salvation was never formally recognized beyond his Bronze Star and promotion. He requested no additional recognition and declined multiple offers of post-war commendation. His legacy is not in decorations, but in the hundreds of soldiers who survived Balete Pass and told his story. No one ever doubted him again.